The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Don't adjust your screen. There is nothing wrong. You're about to enter a world where the very concept of time is rendered obsolete by the sheer power of entertainment. You're about to enter the Boggis Hour. The host of the Boggis Hour, Greg Boggis.
Welcome to this episode of the Boggis Hour, where first I'd like to give Donald Trump one more opportunity to appear on my show. Give me a call, Donald. Come on to New Hampshire. Be on this show. And we interview a good friend of mine, an author, a legendary Boston comedian, the one and only Mike Donovan. Well, welcome again to the Boggis Hour, and I'm glad to have on as my guest, Mike Donovan, comedian, author, friend.
Always good to be hanging out with you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming up from Boston to New Hampshire, to my domain. Let's start pretty early on about with stand-up comedy in your early career. You just mentioned that you're moving in on your, or have reached
this year is my 40th year as a professional stand-up comedian. I did my first show in Corning, New York on January 17th, 1975.
So you started out pretty young compared to most of the other guys.
Yeah, I'm 60 years old. I started out when I was 9. I was a week short of my 20th birthday.
So yeah, it seemed, from what I recall, a lot of times that was like teenage dudes, a pretty young dude back then. Now it's not, but back then it was kind of the rare guy that was that young doing stand-up.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
No?
There weren't many comedy clubs, that's for sure. You go to New York, there was Catch a Rising Star and the Improv, and in L.A. it was the Comedy Store, and I think there was an Improv. I think there was 4 comedy clubs in the country.
And so there was nothing in Boston?
Zero.
So what was the impetus that got you into doing stand-up comedy?
Well, I was growing up in Southie, and I had to do something. I didn't have any other. I look back. It's like Barry Crimmins mentioned. It's like we were minstrels. Right. It's like, wow, what are my options? I dropped out of freshman college, and what am I gonna? But when I listened to George Carlin and Bill Cosby albums, I hate to mention Cosby. You put the roofies in the Jell-O. But he was my idol. No longer.
Something happened between then and now to change that calculation.
Yeah, but when I used to listen to, I wanted to be a baseball player. As far as I'm concerned, that's what, in my neighborhood anyway. I hear people say, guy won an Olympic medal. That's what every kid wants. That's what every kid dreamed. Not in my neighborhood. Everybody wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, pretty much. And I did too. I didn't have the talent,
right,
but that's all I ever dreamed of. And then when I let go of that dream, I'm 13, 14. Well, now what do I do? And then I'm listening to Bill Cosby and George Carlin albums, and I knew I could do impressions. How about David Brinkley?
Oh,
One of my best impressions was David Brinkley. And I might also mention that his book, Washington Goes to War, is one of the best World War II books I've ever read.
That's an excellent Brinkley.
But I knew I did impressions. I did LBJ. I wrote my own. It was semi-ripped off from somebody I saw on TV. My fellow Americans, a grave crisis is at hand. The United States of America has experienced a great tragedy. Linda Bird is pregnant. That was from my very first act when I was 16 years old. And here's another joke. I could still do this shit. I did a fake newscast. I'm 16 years old. Here's a blind witness news note of community interest now for you. The Massachusetts School for the Deaf will hold a 2-week course in musical appreciation. It's to be held outdoors at Logan Airport, and the public is invited. Have a good night, everybody. That's not bad for 16 years
That's
old.
pretty good for 16. That's really good. So did you like was a lot of your early stuff like sketchy almost with
It was anchored around impressions. You know, I watched the professionals, what they did, which is a little joke. You don't want the joke to be too strong to supersede the impression, but
Right.
the impression needs to have a complementary joke that's just kind of underpining it.
right.
But basically, you're still showcasing your impressions. You know, I watched Frank Gorshin and,
Sure,
Rich
so-
Little. I watched what they do.
Right.
I just imitated that style. So I started out as basically an impressionist, but I wasn't too stupid to not realize that you got to add a little joke.
Yeah, because just impressions are great, but a lot of times in and of themselves aren't necessarily funny. So, like you said, you got to sauce it up a little bit. Which brings me to when I first actually met you, saw you for the first time, the Amherst Country Club back in the '80s.
Yeah.
And you did a phenomenal Johnny Most.
Johnny Most. Yeah, there's a story. Let me tell you a story. One of my stories, this is the book, 101 Stories of American History, and one of these is called Johann Most. There it is. I don't know if you can see that. There was a guy born in Bavaria by the name of Johann Most. He was even more left-wing than you. This is how bad this guy was. He was insane. He was a bomb thrower, an anarchist, constantly getting arrested in Germany, in and out of jails in Australia, advocating violent revolution and out-and-out anarchy. He was an anarchist in the literal sense of the term. Then he went to the United States. They had booted him out of Europe, this Johann Most.
And we took him.
We took him in, and then he kept getting arrested in the United States. When President McKinley was assassinated, he said he deserved it, and we
wow.
should start shooting more people, anybody that's part of the establishment. Anyway,
Woo.
I'm writing this story about Johann Most, and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to do something clever, and I'm going to add a fiction that his grandson was Johnny Most, the Celtics announcer. And that'll be very clever. Turns out he was.
Really?
Johnny Most, the Celtics announcer, was the grandson of this violent anarchist. And of course, I had at the end, well, that explains his insanity as a Celtics announcer. He wanted the officials killed.
Yeah,
if they
he
made
was always
bad
a violent
calls.
stock.
You know, most people say we're mad at the officials. He wanted their heads on a platter. Well, there you go. That explains it. Johann Most. But yeah, that was my closing bit for many years. And when I finally dropped the bit, I got a lot of negative feedback. How come you don't do... Listen, I don't want to anchor myself to a local bit that's fading.
Right.
You know, you got to, retool the file cabinets. You know, there's many a show I probably could have, pumped it up with the Johnny, but it was important to let it go. You know, I
Right.
did it for 10 years. That's enough.
That's a pretty good run for
Yeah, it was a closing bit. It was funny.
So you brought your book in here. So as you're doing your stand-up, you always have an interest in history?
I would say, and this is interesting, I haven't gotten a chance to make this. I've been on WBZ for a few years now on the radio. I've been dying to make this point, is that, yes, I love history, but I think I love words, writing, the language, developing literary skills just as much as history itself. That's why I don't... You must watch the History Channel all the time. I got news for you. I never watch it.
Right.
I'm into books. I'm into reading. I'm into writing. That's what I do all day and all night. I spend some time with my wife. Other than that, you're one of the rare people that I've actually spent social time with. I'm a hermit.
Right.
And I'm trying to always better myself as a scholar and a writer. And interesting, Stephen King had a 20 tips for writers. And I thought, well, this ought to be interesting. And a lot of people would say, what's the first thing he's going to say? Well, the first thing he's going to say is, keep writing. Just keep writing. That's the main thing. Keep writing. No. First thing he said, and he came back to this point later on, too, he kind of said it twice. keep reading.
Right.
How can you be a writer if you're not a reader? You know, and when people invite me out after the show to go out for pizza, I'm like, well, that's 2-3 power hours of study time and writing time you're taking away. I'll never get those 3 hours back. And as a comedian, when I go out and hang out with people after the show, they start to go, gee, this guy doesn't smile much. or they start laying compliments on me like that. Hey, you're a really good comedian, you know. Hell, let's have another beer. This guy's... What's in it for me?
Sure.
To sit around and have people either pick on me for not smiling enough or give me compliments that mean nothing to me. I'd rather be home working, you know. So, but I'm into, the point being, originally I had decided I wanted to be a sports writer. And I have done so. I've written for Sports Illustrated. I've had some freelance articles published in sports. But one day, I was visiting a friend at a library in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and I'm walking around. Can I get up? Can I?
Yeah, sure.
I'm walking. I'm looking for the baseball aisle in this library because I'm into baseball books. I'm reading them left and right. And all of a sudden, I accidentally slip into the history section, and there's all these books about the Native Americans and the Indian Wars, and I take them out. I go, this is curious, and I come back, and I sit down, and I put them down on the table in the library, and I'm looking at them, and it was this epiphany. Like, I have been wasting my time on sports. This counts 100 times more.
Sure.
And that was August of '79. And that day, I came home from that library, and I was visiting a friend, and he said, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on? I said, I have. You know, I've seen, like, the spirit of, you know, Christmas Future. Like,
right.
It was like the Christmas Carol. I'm like, I've woken up. And since that day, I haven't read another baseball book.
Really?
And all I do is read history books.
Wow.
Because it's so much more important. But either way, the main thing was the written word, you know, writing, you know,
right.
Vocabulary, style, you know. And people have always told me that, well, your act is very well written. But that is the key to my success, because basically I'm an introvert, and if not for having a well-written act that I can feel strong behind, I wouldn't have the ability to jump up and be like interactive dinner theater where you have to run around and be goofy to everybody and engage everybody and be funny. That's not for me. But to have the writing skills and have an act that's well established and you know it by heart, doesn't it scare you to be on stage? Well, if I didn't have a good act that was well written and I didn't have confidence in it, I would be scared.
So that's essentially a foundation that keeps you solid as a performer, is that you have this well developed.
I know that my act is well written. So the only thing that can hurt me is if the audience, it's chaos, they're drunk, they're not listening. I know that if people listen to my act, I will do well.
Right. But yeah, there's those environmental factors, like you said.
Well, you never know. The PA goes out.
Right.
You know, and one thing about stand-up comedy, if you're doing a joke and you're about to get to the punchline and a bomb goes off up the back of the club and 3 people are killed and 6 are wounded and it's headlines the next day, if you go up to some person that was in the audience and you say, what about that joke? It's, oh, that was a terrible joke he was telling. In other words, if the PA goes out, no matter what, you will always be blamed for lack of results. Nobody says, well, you know, if it weren't for that PA that kept shorting out, I'm sure that guy was very funny.
Right.
No one will say that. The only thing they will say is that guy stunk. So you're up against it.
Right.
You know, there's a lot to fear. A lot of people, you know, I had a job driving a cab for a while, and it was really worthwhile because I found out that people liked me okay. But when I'm at the club and I'm closing the show, people think I'm pretty uptight. Well, I am. I got a lot to worry about.
Sure.
Stuff can go wrong. Oh, don't worry, you'll be fine. Mike Donovan's sitting in the corner. He looks nervous. I thought he was an experienced comedian. Unless you're famous and they scream and laugh when you just say hello.
Yeah, you've still got to deliver.
It's a pretty scary task every time. It's never easy unless, I mean, I'm doing the Schubert Theater this Friday. It's a big show. Ironically, that should be, knock on wood, that should be an easy show.
Yeah.
It's a big theater. You would think, well, that must be a lot of pressure. There's 6,000 people. It's the best venue you've ever played. But that's easy. What's tough is like 25 people. It's scattered. People walk. You've been there 100 times.
Oh,
People
yeah.
walking in and out of the room. Someone's talking in the front. People on their cell phone. Yeah, and as you're being introduced, 15 people get up to use the bathroom, and you can't get off to a good start. The people are coming back from the bathroom just as you're starting to get it going. There's a lot to worry about.
Sure.
So you can end up seeming like a very uptight person, but you got to walk a mile in my shoes. I'm closing the show. If I'm doing a 10-minute guest spot in the middle, I come in with a very relaxed attitude.
But yeah, as the headlining spot too. If the show doesn't go well, they're not going to say, "Oh, if only that opener had done better." It would be, "If only the headliner
You always
had done
take the
better."
blame.
So, are there any funny stories besides Johnny Most?
Well, it's quite a mix of serious stories and silly stories and stuff that's somewhere in between, and I try to pump a little into it. I'll give you one example. The opening story, I like to tell this one. It's called George Washington's Mama Saves the Country. And I don't know if you remember the cartoon strip by Mel Lazarus, Mama.
Oh, I do.
Yeah, okay. And I might have to rewrite it on the next edition because some people don't seem to remember that, but I used the reference. It's 1751, and an 18-year-old young man by the name of George Washington has decided that he's going to leave Virginia and go to the Caribbean and join the Royal Navy because his older brother Lawrence, he worshipped his older brother, and Lawrence was already in the Royal Navy. This was his dream come true, to join the Royal Navy. So he's got the bags all packed in the front, and the carriage is coming to get him to take him to the Royal Navy. And he's saying goodbye to his mother. This comes from the book, The Indispensable Man by Flexner. It's a great book. And as the carriage is pulling up, he says, "Goodbye, Mama." And Mama says, "Don't worry, George. I'll be fine. Just leave me alone just like your brother did. Don't worry about me. Everything's going to be good. Just think of yourself just like your brother did." And then George Washington went, "Okay, Mama, you win." He paid the carriage driver. The carriage driver went off.
He stays.
And the rest is history.
Right.
So that's a little bit of a light story, but nevertheless, it's also an important story, the way history turns on little moments.
Yeah, I think to me that's one of you talked about like sports and history and all that. The only sports book I ever read was one called The Empire Strikes Back by Ron Luciano, which was a great book. But other than that, I've followed current events in history, and I've just always found these incredibly, small things that happen that end up really
big time.
turning the tide of...
Let me give you another one. This is my favorite. There's no comedy in this one, but this is a very important story. Like I say, I mix them up. There'll be a light, goofy story, but then this is kind of a heavy story. In 1912, now ask yourself, have you ever heard of this suggestion? One-term presidency, 6 years. You heard about that? Every once in a while this comes up. How about if we have the presidency 6 years, one term? That way we don't spend 2 out of every 4 years
running for office.
That's been proposed many times over the years, but what I didn't know until recently while I was researching this book, and this comes from Joseph Daniels, he was the Secretary of the Navy, and he wrote a 2-volume work called The Wilson Era, and this is where this story comes from. And I haven't seen this in any of the general history books, but he has a whole chapter on this. In 1912, the Democratic Party had decided that they're going to run their candidate, and part of their platform is going to be a pledge to the 6-year term, the one-term presidency. Not only that, this is very significant, the Congress was behind it in a bipartisan way. They passed a resolution in early 1912, maybe late 1911, but they passed a resolution saying we heartily recommend a change in the Constitution for a one-term presidency, a 6-year term. So Woodrow Wilson gets the nomination. Everything's all set. It's going to happen. And he looks at the proposal and says, "I'm not doing that.
Oh.
I'm not doing that." So just on the individual whim of one man, I shouldn't say whim because it's a big decision.
Sure.
But on the decision of one man, history changed. If he had just merely went along with the tide that was pushing him, we would have a completely different history in our country right now.
Well, you think that Roosevelt served, or was elected to 4 terms, served 3.
Yeah, well, when he won in 1944, he said to his staff, "Remember, boys, the first 12 years are the toughest."
That's great. How about any like Massachusetts stories in there? Anybody?
There's a few, actually. There's one, Angela Grimke of the fabulous Grimsky sisters, Angela and Sarah Grimke. They were Southern belles, and they didn't like slavery. Now, see, in the South, if you were a man and you stood up against slavery, they would just beat you up. I mean, almost literally, you just get beaten up. So then you stopped speaking out against slavery. You
caned over their head.
to the North. But the Grimsky sisters, the Grimke, Grimke, they were women, and they were outspoken, so we can't beat them up. We got our Southern honors now handcuffing us. So they eventually got driven out of the South, and I think they broke with their own family. But they used to sneak into slave huts and teach the slaves how to read. They used to go in the house crying when they saw the slaves being whipped. Anyway, they went on a tour of the North. It was like the Rolling Stones. Everywhere the Grimke sisters went, it was standing room only. And they were making speeches all over the North. As you know, it's one thing to be a Northern abolitionist, but you need a Southern abolitionist to really, rock the house. So they went on this SRO, standing room only tour all over the North. And in 1838, Angela Grimke addressed the Massachusetts State Senate. And she was the first woman ever to address a legislative body in America, including colonial times. And I'm looking for illustrators, by the way, especially someone in school, like a school child. I'm looking for illustrators to, maybe some school could get a hold of this book and have some of their students draw illustrations. The Speaker of the House was sitting behind Angela Grimke during her speech, and he just had tears pouring down his cheeks the whole time as she's describing the horrors of slavery. And I just would like to have somebody do an artistic recreation of Angela Grimke addressing the Massachusetts State Senate, or maybe even a recreation in the room itself.
Sure, that's a great story. Yeah, New Hampshire has some interesting history as far as slavery and all that. Frederick Douglass spoke in my hometown of Milford. Milford was actually a hotbed of abolitionism, and there was a group called the Hutchinson Singers. There was like a family of 9 kids or something like that, but 4 of them, there was like 3 brothers and a sister, and they played a stand-up bass and fiddles and sang Christian abolition songs. So that was the Hutchinson Singers in Milford.
And I'm trying to do more. I have another one coming out before Christmas called 101 Stories of World War II. And my hope is to get on the USO tour with that. Because personally, my stand-up act, I don't want to do it for the troops.
Yep.
That's not for me. But if I can get a slideshow, I already do the assisted living facilities now. I have a slideshow. I have a lecture. It's kind of a replica of the book. Each story here but I would love to be able to take that show to the troops.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff. Want to give me one more? Can you think of one more that you want to talk about before? We got about a couple minutes left.
Chelsea Coda. I named him Chelsea Coda. There's a guy named Norman Coda, and he was from Chelsea. And he was on the beach at Normandy, and the guys were all on the ground, terrified on the beach, and he walked up and down the beach telling everyone the same speech. He said, "Son, if you get up and go over those hedges and get off this beach, you're probably going to get killed. But if you stay here, you're definitely going to get killed." And that every time he gave that speech, a guy, you got a point there, and he'd get up and leave.
Oh, wow.
Then Chelsea Coda, and I named him that. Chelsea Coda does a one-man recon. He goes off the beach and goes up about 2 miles deep into enemy, all by himself. He's a general. And he almost got the Medal of Honor for this, but he also got chewed out by Bradley. He says, We don't have a lot of talent at AAA. If you get killed, we don't have a lot of great replacements ready for you. And also the nickname for Norman Schwarzkopf, Storm and Norman,
Yep.
that's a derivative of the name of Storm and Norman Coda.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Well, Mike Donovan's book, 101 Stories of American History. Mike Donovan, a stand-up comic, a friend of mine. I'm glad that you came to the show.
All right, it's on Amazon.
Yeah, you can find it on Amazon, and you'll be performing throughout New England. You can find you online.
And I'm not going to let you get away with this. You're going to do a book either by yourself or with me. Give us a year, 101 Stories of New Hampshire History. And if you have an unusual story, a powerful story about New Hampshire, submit it to us. You can find us. Where you Google Greg Boggis.
Yeah, Greg P.
Google
Boggis.
Mike Donovan. You'll find us. Give us suggestions. We've already got about 20. We're already in the process of working on this book, so the official announcement that it's going to happen is right here and now.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad that you came, and hope to see you again. And next time we got another book coming out, we'll do another show.
All right, always good to see you.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on The Boggis Hour, email us here at thebogishour@gmail.com.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.